Welcome to the Black Man in Islam conference hosted by Ministry to Muslims. I am your host, Kevin Briggins, Managing Director for the Center for Biblical Unity. We are proud to introduce our next speaker, AYO SADIPE. AYO runs the YouTube channel I know as the Third Apology. He has engaged in apologetics since he was 13 years old, with an emphasis on general theology, atheism, and Islam. AYO started the channel in 2020 as an outlet for the things that he was learning, and now used it as a platform to engage with the unsaved and encourage equipped believers in their faith. So AYO, brother, the floor is yours.
Awesome, Kevin. Thank you so much. I just want to do a quick audio check. Do I sound okay?
No, you're good.
You're good. Awesome. Okay, cool. So regarding the presentation, I have it here in the background. Awesome. There we go. You're on top of it. Thank you so much. Alrighty, so ladies and gentlemen, just want to say I'm so thankful to be here. Thankful to Pastor George for hosting this conference. I know this topic is especially important to him. Thank you to Kevin as well for hosting the whole panel discussions and the different speakers today, as well as Lewis, who went before me and gave an excellent breakdown of just Islam's views on Black people, slavery, etc. Now, I have the difficult topic or the difficult task of following that because he obviously covered a lot of relevant sources, some that you're going to see in my presentation as well. But what I'm hoping I can bring to the table that's different is a bit more of a historical survey regarding the slave trade, specifically in relation to the Arabs, Islam, etc. So we're going to get into it. There's going to be a lot of interesting little historical pieces and pictures, and there's actually going to be a bit to get through. So I'm going to do my best to cover everything as necessary, but we are going to have to move a little bit fast. Okay, so in case the information is relevant to you, just be ready to screenshot or whatever else you may need to do. So let's go ahead and start here. So first, I want to start off by establishing what this presentation is not, right? Because we may have Muslims in the chat who are watching, people who are questioning, and I want to just be clear from the outset about what the goal of this is. So I'm looking down here at my laptop. I'm still with you guys, but let's see here. It says, this is not a claim that Islam is the only religion that has perpetuated slavery, the only people groups that have done this in the name of a religion that have perpetuated slavery. So when I present about this, I'm not trying to say that, this is only something that is relevant to Islam. It's also not even proof that Islam is necessarily false. Now, do you have issues if the God of Islam, Allah, is allowing and sanctioning divinely these sorts of things that we're going to see? Absolutely. Major red flags. But if we're being technical, it's not intrinsically a proof that the tenets of the belief are false. So even then, I'm not necessarily setting out to disprove Islam or even to prove Christianity. It's also not an argument that all Muslims supported the slave trade, right? So you're going to see a lot of different pictures and different things. I'm not saying that every person who ever trafficked slaves during this time period was a devout follower of Muhammad, but were there those people? 110%. It's also not a claim that all Muslims are racist. That should go without saying. It's also not a claim that similar practices haven't been done in the name of Christianity, because we know that there's a huge history with that, in the name of, at least. So if that's the case, and if I'm clearly not trying to achieve these certain things, then what's the point of this presentation? Well, let's get into it. There's a common saying that I've heard before. I'm not sure who it's attributed to, but it says, where there's smoke, there's fire. So just because you may have these things laid out in a religion, even if it may not intrinsically prove that religion is false, it's definitely a lead. As I said earlier, it's definitely a red flag that should cause us to investigate. This is also something that's very important because it is Black History Month. And as we'll get into later, you have a lot of Black people who have converted to Islam almost as a kind of reactionary response to Christianity, seeing Christianity as something that is the product of our ancestors being imposed with this religion upon them. And so they think that they're in this safe haven with Islam. It's separate from all these sorts of things. And my goal with this presentation is to give them that context that shows them, no, it's not just people who did things in the name of Christ. It's also people who have done things in the name of Allah and Muhammad. And that none of us can really get on a high horse when it comes to these things. All of humanity is sinful. And although one religion may certainly teach one thing and one religion may not, you're always going to have people who misappropriate things. But we're going to get into whether or not Islam itself actually teaches this too. Alrighty, so first I want to start off with what the current narrative you often hear regarding slavery just around the world is. Now, I know this varies depending on what part of the world we're in, but for us here in the United States, in the West, this is the common narrative that we've heard in school. Now, I'm doing my best to not read verbatim from my slides, but I did draft this slide as a kind of, anecdote of what the common narrative is. And so I want to read this verbatim just because I took some time to do it. So it says here, as far as the mainstream narrative goes, slavery is a moral evil that falls primarily on the shoulders of white people. The most egregious example being the transatlantic slave trade, in which millions of Africans were kidnapped, bought, and sold into harsh and involuntary working conditions, leaving entire generations displaced from their homelands and oppressed. On top of that, many, if not all, of the whites who perpetuated these acts at least excuse them or not. I'm sorry, let me reread that. On top of that, many, if not most of the whites who perpetuated these acts, or at least excused them, did so in the name of Christianity. There we go. So for many Black Muslims today, part of the motivation for following Islam is what they feel is a resistance toward the oppression that has been imposed upon them historically by Christian slave masters, whatever it may have been. And something that accents the reality of what we see here is actually it's a screenshot of one of the opening exhibit pieces at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. Now, I went here myself and I saw this myself, and immediately the alarm started going off when I read what we see here in this screenshot. It says, in reference to the transatlantic slave trade, you can see the dates. 500 years ago, a new form of slavery transformed Africa, Europe, and the Americas. For the first time, people saw other human beings as commodities, things to be bought, sold, and exploited to make enormous profits. This system changed the world, and it goes on. Now, again, am I saying that these sorts of things did not happen during the transatlantic slave trade? Absolutely not. But I really want you guys to remember this screenshot here, because once we get to the end of this presentation, with all due respect, you're going to see how ludicrous this statement in this exhibit is. Again, I'm not saying that there isn't, that there aren't valuable things that you can learn from this museum, but this was just especially egregious because of the fact that it's just simply not true. 500 years ago, a certain new thing began in the sense that the transatlantic slave trade began, but the ideas that shaped it, the principles that motivated the sort of treatment that we saw, was far from new. And so we're going to get into it. All right, so first thing we're going to do here is basically get into the standard Islamic narrative. So as far as it goes, we have Muhammad, right? He's born in 570. He's from Arabia. He's a prophet of Allah, and he's a communicator of this divine revelation via the angel Gabriel. He founded the original Islamic Caliphate, which was the beginning of what was one of the most rapid and total military expansions in all of world history. On a purely objective level, militarily, it was absolutely incredible. And so Muhammad dies in 632. All right, so from there, what do we see? So were the Muslims taking slaves? It began, as I said, under the very first caliphate after Muhammad's death, the Rashidun Caliphate. And we see that Muslims absorbed existing slavery systems and or perpetuated their own. Their slave trading grew massively under the subsequent Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates. And so on the map here on the right, you can see a map representing the Abbasid Caliphate in the 9th century. Wasn't even necessarily the height. There were certain territories that the Muslims fought for even afterward, but you can see just how far-reaching much of this empire actually was, especially in light of how Muhammad's death was just a few short hundred years ago. So now we're going to ask the question of where were the slaves taken? And in this next slide, you guys are going to see a map. And this map is going to be a little bit detailed, so try not to get too overwhelmed. But I really want you guys to just focus on one part of it. Okay, so we're going to get a visual of where many of these slaves, as opposed to the transatlantic slave trade, were being taken. Okay, so let's take a look here. All these arrows here that are purple or blue, that's Portuguese, that's French. I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but for the sake of what we're talking about this morning, we're going to focus on what's going on above here. Green arrows, main slave routes of Arabs, Berbers, and this is the African slave trade around 1750. So as you can see here, we see them being taken through the Sahara, up top to places like Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, Egypt, Cairo, past the Red Sea into Arabia, even up toward Persia, and then through the Indian Ocean to places like even as far as Western India. So this is what I want to focus on, because again, here in the West, this reality of where these African slaves were taken and who they were taken by is just something that's not explored very much at all. So because this is 1750, let me just go back real quick. Because this is 1750, this is occurring during the Ottoman Empire. And as I noted before, we see some of the key locations here: Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria. You can see some of the locations there on the right for the Middle East. And then we also, as I showed earlier, have the routes that were being trafficked through the Indian Ocean. So West India, Southern Iraq, that's a reference to the Zanj rebellion, which I promise we will get into later. Persia and Iran, Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, places like that as well. And so as you can see here on the right, here's a picture of slaves who were actually intercepted by British Navy officers in the Indian Ocean. Going to be a lot more of these types of pictures that we get into. Another picture here, slaves in the Indian Ocean Passage who were taken from East Africa. And so I want to note some important things before we continue. So first of all, as I said before, this wasn't just something perpetuated by one Islamic empire, so to speak, right? We had the Rashidun, we had the Umayyads, we had the Abbasids. All these different groups were kind of getting in on the action, so to speak, and getting a different piece of the pie. And they all followed each other successively. So by the time we get to 1750, where you saw the map was from, we have the Ottomans, who were following a very long line of Islamic caliphates that all perpetuated these sorts of things. So this is important to note, just because it's important to have that nuance to show that it wasn't just like this one group necessarily, but that it was something that took place over a vast period of time. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the purpose and the role of many of these slaves during this time. So lots of things that we can talk about here. How did they function in these regions? So first and foremost, we have domestic servants. Now, this was just a reality of what many of the slaves there had to do. You had slaves who were cooks, cleaners, they took care of children, they were personal assistants, and they were eunuchs. So here's an image on the right of a slave servant in Egypt, ancient piece of art. And I really want to use this next part to highlight the eunuchs and exactly what was going on with them, because that is something that is crazy. So eunuchs during the slave trade. So what is a eunuch, in case you don't know? Well, first and foremost, females, and we will talk about how the women were treated, but the females were often taken as sex slaves for the personal harem of caliphs. During the time, or during the time period, I should say, depending on which section you looked at and which region you looked at, you had many times where women were the vast majority of the slaves taken from Africa and other non-Islamic lands. And so because of the large number of women who were used as being part of a harem, is essentially for sex, you needed people, the eunuchs, who were in a position to essentially guard them. And so these eunuchs were chosen for certain characteristics in order to make sure that this could be something that was upheld successfully. So one of the things that's been documented well is that they often chose Black Africans because the Arabs often saw them as ugly and didn't want them to have any sort of physical attractiveness advantage when interacting on such a common and frequent level with the women in the harem. So they often chose Africans because they saw them as ugly. And then even if that wasn't in the picture, one of the things that they made sure they did was castrate them. So, you know, Google that if you don't know what it means, but they castrated them to ensure the sexual integrity of the situation as well. They didn't want, obviously, any of the African eunuchs reproducing or getting busy, so to speak, with any of the women in their harem and jeopardizing any of that. Now, because of this, they castrated them, and the mortality rate of such a procedure was extremely high when it came to how they did this sort of stuff. They often wanted to castrate the Africans even before they got to the slave markets. And so, as we'll see, this was a very barbaric practice in which many, many, many of the Africans actually died because they just simply couldn't survive the procedure. So, as I said before, many died because of multiple factors, including the fact that there was no anesthesia, there was hardly any regard for sanitation, and when they were castrated, there was often blood loss, infections, as well as dehydration and shock. And so, because of these things and the fact that many of these eunuchs couldn't reproduce in these regions, you have a very, very small, I don't want to say non-existent, but just comparatively speaking, a very small amount of actual descendants from these Africans in these regions today. The communities exist and you can look them up, but when you look up communities surviving in places like Brazil, for example, African communities that have survived in Brazil. I mean, obviously here in the US, right, we have so many descendants of people who, when you go back, were slaves brought from Africa. That sort of thing is not nearly as real in these regions, just because so many of those eunuchs could not reproduce and many of them died during the actual castration process. So here's a picture on the right of a eunuch in the imperial palace of the Ottoman Empire during the year 1912. Obviously recent enough to where we can have pictures. So this one is a little graphic, but I really thought of including it just because I thought that it was necessary to, it's easy to say the word castration, but reading something like this, I think, will emphasize and illustrate just how barbaric these sorts of things were and how difficult they were for the people who had to go through this in Africa. So here we have a quote from Swiss traveler and geographer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt. Excuse me if I butchered that, but he was a traveler all over the world, Marco Polo type guy, and he went to Nubia and Upper Egypt during the 1800s. And here he records what sort of procedure they actually had to go through in order to be castrated. So it says, the young man was held down on top of the table, and while his genitalia were tied off with a soap-coated silken cord, they were then swiftly cut off with a razor, and following surgery, a wooden or tin tube was inserted into the eunuch's urethra. The wound was cauterized with ash and hot sand, and then slightly later with boiling oil. So you can see how so many just simply did not survive that procedure. There are estimates that put the mortality rate a little bit lower than 80 to 90%, but in my research, there were essentially none that portrayed it in any sort of favorable light. So the other type of slaves that were taken from Africa were military slaves, or Mamluks. I should also qualify that and say that some were taken from Africa, but many were also taken from non-Islamic lands in general. So these were young boys captured from these lands and turned into soldiers. They were taken from their families, brought up in the ways of Islam, and essentially trained to be soldiers for whatever empire was there at the time, whether it's the Janissaries under the Ottoman Empire, as well as the Mamluks from empires and caliphates before. Now, this position was often a lot more favorable. You could potentially rise to higher ranks, and you could often get certain socioeconomic privileges that just weren't going to be there for other groups, depending on how well you performed, all that sort of stuff. But make no mistake, they were still seen as slaves, and there were certain rights that were deprived of them. But I will say personally that if I had to choose, I'd probably be one of these guys, just because the potential was a lot greater. Now we got to talk about, of course, the slave girls. So as I said before, depending on the time and region, you had up to 2/3 of the slaves being taken being women, right? And although many of them did perform domestic roles for sure, the undeniable elephant in the room is that many of them were used for sex. And Caucasian women, white women from many of these European lands were seen as especially valuable. And so here's just a piece of artwork representing a lot of what the reality was for many of these women at that time, if they were unfortunate enough to be captured. So here's a testimony of the treatment of some of the women that was noted down by explorers like David Livingstone, as well as Johann again. We can read one of them here. It says, I frequently witnessed scenes of the most shameless indecency with the traders, who were the principal actors, and they were scenes that they only laughed at. I may venture to state that very few female slaves who have passed their 10th year reach Egypt or Arabia in a state of virginity. So Obviously, for those of us who know the Islamic sources, 10th year, very few of them are reaching Arabia or Egypt in a state of virginity. It obviously is a huge callback to the sort of relations that Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, was having with his wife, Aisha, whom he had sex with when she was only 9 years old. So clearly, as Lewis noted in his presentation, many of these people are seeing this example of Muhammad and clearly feeling no qualms about engaging in the same sort of acts, even centuries later. David Livingston, in his travels to the same region about a half century later, says, "To overdraw its evils is a simple impossibility. We passed a slave woman shot or stabbed through the body and lying on the path. Onlookers said an Arab who passed early that morning had done so in anger at losing the price he had given for her because she was unable to walk any longer. We passed a woman tied by the neck to a tree and dead. We came upon a man dead from starvation. The strangest disease I have seen in this country seems to really be brokenheartedness, and it attacks free men who have been captured and made slaves." Absolutely brutal. So next, we also got to talk about the common picture that we think of when we think of slavery in the West, which is the agricultural or manual labor slaves. So during the Abbasid Caliphate in the 9th century, in the 800s, they were especially known for taking these sorts of slaves because in southern Iraq, in the Bosphorus region today, they took people who were from East Africa that they referred to as the Zanj and took them to this region in order to basically work the land in order to do cultivation for sugar as well as dates. They had them canal digging in the marsh, and they were forced to remove the saline topsoil that was causing the soil in the region to basically be unarable, unable to be used for agriculture. And so they put these slaves to work manually to get them to break up that soil, drain the swamps, do different things like that, that made it suitable for planting. So I want you guys to put yourself in their shoes, these slaves, for example, during the Abbasid Caliphate in the 800s. You're in this region in southern Iraq, the Basra region. Temperatures can regularly exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Because of different things that have happened in the environment, the soil, as you see in this image, has become salinized. So because of that, you can't just simply plant seeds and expect plants to grow. So the soil, the dry soil that's full of the salt, needs to be broken up. So you've got to first break up the crust. It's almost like cement at its worst. You don't have modern technology to do this. You don't have modern excavating tools and this and that. You've got to break up this soil, the salty soil, I should say, carry it away. You've got to dig new canals so fresh water can come in. As I said, temperature is extremely high, high humidity. There's malaria, different diseases floating around from mosquitoes that are in the area. And this must all be done continuously because it's not something like deforestation where once you just clear the forest, you're good. If you don't maintain the environment, the soil is going to dry out again. And so they had to work year round, round the clock in order to make sure that once they worked, the soil wouldn't basically return to its previous state. This was absolutely brutal, absolutely backbreaking work that, again, especially without modern technology, was just such a nightmare in order for them to have to do day by day. So the situations that they were in, these sort of circumstances, were the perfect seeds for what is known as the Zanj Rebellion. So the Zanj Rebellion began during that Abbasid Caliphate in 1869. And it's actually the longest slave rebellion in world history. It edges out the slave rebellion in Haiti by just a year or two, I believe. But by the numbers, this is the longest slave rebellion. So it's just wild because as a result of these conditions, you had many slaves, both African and non-African, who ended up rebelling. And the Abbasids had an enormous amount of trouble putting down this rebellion because of the fact that they were stretched thin in other areas. They were distracted militarily by other things going on. And this emboldened many of the Africans who were rebelling to continue taking cities and holding them. So eventually it was put down, but you have a wide range in terms of the amount of people who died as a result of this. Some saying it was as little as 100,000 to some saying it's in the millions. It's very, very hard to get an accurate number, but it's clear that with a rebellion lasting that long, the casualties were for sure going to be astronomical. I always found it interesting, again, how despite being the longest slave rebellion. It was something I essentially heard nothing about in school. Now, I'm sure in other parts of the world, especially East Africa, this is something that they learned about. But I do find it interesting how it wasn't something given much emphasis here in the West. So now I want to talk about slavery in the modern world, because we've obviously discussed a lot of what was going on during the early Islamic history under various caliphates. I have sprinkled in some pictures of more recent times, but I really want to give a focus on that, because for those people who may turn to Islam as a reactionary response to Christianity, they may try to explain these things away by just simply saying, oh, well, you know, yeah, that happened, but it was unique to the time and that's what they did, et cetera, et cetera. You know, I understand that, but I really want to show just how modern this really was for many of these regions. So one of the first examples of this is the Barbary Wars. So basically, at the time, this is during the 18th century, going into the 19th century, you had these de facto Ottoman states, like the state of Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, who were routinely committing piracy against many ships that were in that North African ocean region. And unfortunately for the United States, this included their ships. They had just newly declared independence, and they unfortunately found out that many of their ships were being victim to piracy by many of these states. They were regularly bullied to pay ransom in order to get the ship and the goods back. And they were bullied into paying kind of like protection tax or a protection fee or a kind of tribute to stop for the Ottomans to stop doing this going forward. During one year in particular, the US ended up using 16% of its overall revenue to actually pay many of these ransom payments. So it was a major, major, major problem that ultimately had to be dealt with. And so in 1796, I find it interesting, there was a peace treaty signed between the US and the Bey of Tunis, who was named Pasha Hamuda. And again, just to kind of show the Islamic element of what was going on here, Pasha Hamuda signed the treaty as commander of the frontier post of the Holy War. So here you can see how in his mind, he sees the kind of jihad piracy that's going on against these ships as an extension of the same war that was waged by the original prophet of Islam himself, Muhammad. Just found that kind of interesting. So in 1786, you had Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, maybe you've heard of them, who met with a guy named Sidi Haji Abd-Rahman, who was the Tripolitania ambassador to London. So he was one of the ambassadors from this North African region that essentially, oversaw what was going on with this piracy. And they're trying to work something out with him, and they're asking him, Thomas Jefferson in particular, he relays this to Congress, and he says, why are you attacking us? Why are you attacking these nations who have done you no injury? And Abd-Rahman, excuse my pronunciation, literally says that the slave rates of the Barbary pirates was founded on the laws of their prophet, that it was written in their Quran that all nations who should not have acknowledged their authority were sinners, that it was their right and duty to make war upon them wherever they could be found, and to make slaves of all they could take as prisoners, and that every Muslim who should be slain in battle was sure to go to paradise. So again, I just find it extremely interesting because this is very early in American history, one of our first wars, and yet again, something I hardly learned about in school. If this wasn't the case for you, that's absolutely awesome. But I do think there is a kind of symptom here in the West where we're just simply not taught about the reality of what was going on, not just, of course, on our shores, but around the world. And as a fun fact, this is actually why the opening lines of the Marines hymn, our United States Marines hymn, says, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, we fight our battles air, land, and sea, or something to that effect. But it mentions the shores of Tripoli because of these sorts of things that were going on very early in the United States' history. So I also want to show some pictures here that I honestly believe speak for themselves when it comes to the reality of the slave trade in the Islamic world then versus now. So we got a few of these. Here on the left, you can see a picture from the 1800s, which is a depiction of African pearl divers in the Persian Gulf. And on the right here, we can obviously see that it's recent enough for photography to exist, and we see pearl divers in Bahrain. And again, when you guys view these pictures, I just really want you to remember that this is in Arabia, this is in Persia, this is in these regions that we often don't think of when it comes to slavery. I feel like because of the way we've been taught, we can often see pictures like this, and especially on the left, and immediately think it's somewhere in, you know, the US or somewhere in some colonial state or something. And again, that's real. But I also want to shine a light on what was going on in these regions as well. Another picture here, 2 Topkapi palace ladies. So the Topkapi palace was in the Ottoman Empire in modern day Turkey. If you've ever heard of the Topkapi Museum, 2 palace ladies and the African eunuch who's assigned to them in 1588. 1929, almost 400 years later, eunuchs and concubines of an Ottoman sultan. Here's a depiction of a slave market in Sudan, 1876. And then on the right, again, I didn't get an exact year, but it's recent enough for photography to obviously exist. And we can see that these are Christian Dinka slaves in Sudan who are waiting for their Muslim slave masters to sell them to a human rights group. Sudan has obviously been in lots of political, military turmoil right now, and many of the Islamic military groups who are kind of ruling the nation in a de facto way have taken it upon themselves to take slaves. But for different reasons, they end up finding it more profitable to end up just selling them to these Christian human rights groups that want to secure their freedom. Slave market in Cairo, 1848. Again, same thing here, slave market with an Egyptian slave master and a Waswahili slave from Africa. So what led to its end only now? There were many motivating factors, but one of the most critical was the fact that the British, even though, yes, they profited off of slavery in their past as well, I'm not excusing that, they ended up banning it in areas like the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. And they put pressures on rulers to abolish their practices. They signed treaties confirming these agreements and intercepted, slave ships in order to free slaves and basically get rid of many of those practices that were going on there. So because of this, the British had a very powerful navy. Many rulers were forced to adjust to this, and despite their intentions to preserve slavery, could not simply keep it functioning under this new world order, so to speak. So why did they outlaw it? Well, one of the big factors was the fact that there was a major abolition force that was growing in the 1800s in Britain. So if you've ever heard of a guy by the name of William Wilberforce, he was a politician turned Anglican abolitionist, and he was huge in pushing for this cause among British society. Photography was something that was coming about, so they were using pictures as a powerful medium to show the consequences of slavery. They were arguing that it was a moral evil, obviously using the Bible and different things like that. And because of the fact that there was also a large revival going on in Britain during the 18th century and American evangelicalism, you basically had a society that was ripe for demanding this sort of change. Now, don't get me wrong, there were other motivations as well. I'm sure at a certain point it was advantageous to Britain strategically in order to stop slavery in these regions. But without a doubt, one of the single biggest factors that swayed public opinion was the work of guys like Wilberforce in changing how the public viewed slavery. And again, just to show you the craziness of this, I didn't highlight this, but as you can see here in this picture on the right, this is a slave being freed in Oman, right? One of the Gulf states, I believe, in 1907 by a British sailor, So again, just one of those pictures where it's like, what? Kind of like this intersection of these two worlds that we often think don't really intersect, and yet clearly we can see here that they do. Here's a picture. Oops, sorry, that got a little cut off on the left, but there's a picture of the Sultan of Zanzibar, who was named Hamoud bin Mohammed. And he's decked out in a bunch of gear that was given to him by Queen Victoria because she was pleased with him for essentially signing a treaty which cut off the slavery from his region. In the previous picture, with the slave who was freed by the British sailor, here are the British arresting that slaver on that same boat. Here's an art piece of the HMS London chasing a slaving dhow, which was a ship used to transport slaves from near Zanzibar. So they're literally hunting down these slave ships in order to free the slaves. Again, when you've just been so fed this narrative that, you know, whites did anything they could to perpetuate slavery at any chance they could get, pictures like these are just, they almost produce an Inception-like kind of feel, right? Again, I'm not trying to excuse everything the British have done in history, but I do think these things give a context that is often underappreciated and underrecognized. This is another picture on the right as well of slavers basically trying to escape and flee with, if you can make it out there, a British ship on their tail in order to liberate the slaves that are there as well. Here's a group of slaves as well who were taken out of a slave ship in a state of starvation. Obviously very sad. You can see the sort of conditions they were living in. And among those slaves who were freed in Oman, we can see another picture of them here, as well as the fact that they were given new clothes by the British. Okay, and then here's another artistic depiction as well. More slaves that were freed. So here are some conservative and liberal estimates regarding how many slaves were actually taken during this time. Some are as low as 10 to 18 million, but they don't account for the things like the mortality rate among those who were castrated, as well as there are some more liberal estimates like the 20 to 30 million, which may overestimate and overproject. So the real number is probably somewhere in between. And that's okay. We're never going to know the actual number, but this is just to emphasize that this was a real thing that was happening. All right, so we're going to try and go a little fast here. Islamic teaching on slavery. I'm going to try to blast through this just because a lot of it was covered by Lewis. But we do see here in Surah 424 that Allah has given a divine sanction for Muslims to take women that their right hand possess in other words, those who they possess via slavery. Now, the context of this is that you had many of Muhammad's followers who had overcome territories and had these women, but they were nervous about having intercourse with them because their husbands were polytheists, according to them, you know? And so Muhammad gets this divine revelation from Allah in which sex with these women is now sanctioned. Here are some more quotes here. I'm just going to kind of fast forward a bit for time. This is an interesting one I did want to highlight. We have here in Sunan An-Nasai 4621. It's called selling animals for animals of different amounts or quality, hand to hand. And it says, a slave came and gave his pledge to the messenger of Allah to emigrate. And the prophet did not realize that he was a slave. Then his master came looking for him, and the prophet said, sell him to me. So he bought him for two black slaves, and he bought him for two black slaves. Then he did not accept until he had asked, is he a slave? So in other words, this guy comes to Muhammad. He says, I'm going to pledge myself to you. Muhammad says, okay, but he doesn't know he's a slave. So once he realizes, he's like, well, shoot, now I've got to pay for him. He trades him for two black slaves, which is interesting, or two black slaves worth less than the one man who may have been Arab. And now going forward, he's asking this question, is he a slave? Not because he's necessarily concerned about slavery, but because he doesn't want to have to pay unknowingly. So again, very interesting. You can see here it's headed selling animals for animals, and then goes on to talk about trading black people. So very questionable things there. I'm sure Lewis talked about this as well too, so I will move forward for the sake of time. Another slide here saying that Muhammad had, there was a man who had none other than 6 slaves at the time of his death. Muhammad called for them and divided them into 3 sections and set 2 free and kept 4 in slavery. So when he had the opportunity to literally allow slaves to go free, he chose to keep the majority in slavery. Similar situation here. I'm going to just skip for the sake of time. Another one here. I know Lewis cited this one about how you should listen to and obey your ruler, even if he was an Ethiopian black slave whose head looks like a raisin, right? So it's not about the fact that he says you need to obey. It's the fact that he feels the need to qualify it based on this person's intrinsic characteristics. Questionable. Some more here that I'm just going to let you screenshot. The bottom one here is interesting, which says that Muhammad bought and sold more slaves than he purchased more slaves than he sold. Another slide that you can screenshot with some references of Muhammad's slaves. More about Muhammad trading slaves. And so because of these different things, and because of the example of Muhammad, who's supposed to be this prophet for all mankind, so to speak, it's no surprise that we have many of these quotes from these very influential Islamic figures on different things. I know Lewis cited some of these, so we'll go through them. Al-Jahiz, he's a famous Muslim scholar. He says, we know that the Zanj are the least intelligent and the least discerning of mankind and the least capable of understanding the consequences of actions. Al-Muqaddasi says, of the neighbors of the Buja, Makdisi had heard that there is no marriage among them. The child does not know his father, and they eat people, but God knows best. As for the Zanj, they are people of black color, flat noses, kinky hair, and little understanding or intelligence. Some more here. Blacks are people who are by their very nature slaves. So another quote here. Many have seen that the ape is more capable of being trained than the Negro and more intelligent. This is a Shia Muslim scholar from the 13th century. Another here saying, therefore, the Negro nation are, as a rule, submissive to slavery because they have little that is essentially human and have attributes that are quite similar to those of dumb animals, as we have stated. So blasting through for time, but I did just want to note the irony of all of this, right? You have a lot of Black people in the US today who have converted to Islam, both now and famous people historically, again, often as a reaction against Christianity. I'm not saying that they can't have reasons outside of that, but often in discussions, their reaction against Christianity and their animosity toward white people is one of the things that is noted. And so I just find this whole thing interesting, these pictures, these different things we've presented, because these are the things in history that you just don't often hear. And so the point in citing this again is not to excuse anything Christians, or I shouldn't say Christians, but people who claim the name of Christ did, or to, point fingers and say that all the blame should go on this group instead. It's just to simply show that history is a lot more complicated and less black and white, no pun intended, than people try to make it out to be. So lastly, I obviously didn't have time to get into the whole issue of whether or not the Bible supports slavery, but I did want to cite a very helpful resource that answered that question for me very thoroughly, and that is John McCrae from What Do You Mean? Back when he first started his channel, he had a exploration responding to Cosmic Skeptic, who's a famous atheist, regarding whether or not the Bible supports slavery. And that playlist is still up on his channel. So if you ever have the time, feel free to check out his channel, go to his playlist, and it's there. It's called The Bible and Slavery Responses. So that's all I got. Thank you so much for tuning in, and hope you guys enjoyed it.
Brother, that was awesome, very educational. I was reading the chat, and people were really appreciative of the information you were bringing. You and Lewis have both done an excellent job of displaying how slavery, especially, is inherent to the ideology of Islam, right? And I've seen it as someone who has dealt with modern day Middle East and dealing with what we call Islamic fundamentalist or Salafist, who seek to reestablish the caliphate in the ways of Muhammad. And you see how when they come to power, how they rule and govern and the things they allow is exactly the same things you guys have laid out. And they're doing so by being faithful to live as Muhammad did. And I think that's the important part. And so, yeah, you guys are right. And you're so right to point out that Black Americans turning to Islam as a rejection of racism and oppression towards Black people is a very, I'm just going to call it ignorant in the sense of the word of not knowing proposition, And so I just want to say great job, and tell the listeners just kind of how they can find your work.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kevin. And I just want to apologize if the presentation seemed a little fast. Obviously, I was on a time limit, and truth be told, there was just so much information, so much I didn't get to include. So it's an unfortunate reality, but I do hope that it was beneficial in some sense. And so if you want to find more of where I'm at, my YouTube channel is called The Third Apology. I haven't been active on it in a while, but this video even now is kind of the beginning of me stepping back into that in 2026. So I have talked about Islam a lot in the past, but also talk about atheism, general theology, just love the Bible, love scripture, love just getting into what the word means. And so I could have just as easily done a presentation on does the Bible itself support slavery, but obviously didn't have the time. I think it was very important, though, to focus on this just because this was a history I myself regarding the slave trade in these regions I had only learned in recent years. And so I hope everyone got to learn something new. I hope it was a blessing to you. And I hope that it prompts your own further study so that you can go and learn about these things and use them to engage with our Muslim friends. So thank you so much, Kevin. Thanks so much, everyone, for watching.
Absolutely. And we appreciate you for sharing, and we'll see you later on the panel discussion.
Awesome.